SBC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe. Supported by SBC Summit Barcelona, the industry-leading conference bringing you the future of sports betting and iGaming.
SBC Summit Barcelona is where you can experience the entire global industry coverage under one roof. Join 10,000 industry professionals for 3 days of game-changing conversation and education. Get your tickets now at sbcevents.com.
Previously underreported, regulatory surveillance has crept up on the iGaming industry's lexicon and agenda during 2023. A somewhat frightening and all-encompassing term is the regulatory surveillance of gambling licenses being defined by governments and authorities across Western Europe's market's ever-changing regulatory landscape. Tough adjustments followed iGaming's transition from its era of merger and acquisition consolidations to its current age of compliance. And the question on today's episode of iGaming Daily, sponsored by SBC Summit Barcelona, is what conflicts will follow as industry heads towards its potential dawn of surveillance. And joining me to talk about all things regulatory surveillance is Ted Menmuir, the content director at SBC, and Martyn Elliott, SBC's senior media manager. How are you both doing today?
Very well, thanks, James.
Ted here, yeah. Speaking of another regulatory update, guys, yes.
Perfect. I am on about my third cup of coffee, so I might get like a caffeine buzz in the next 5 minutes. But, bear with us and we'll get through this topic, which it's interesting to me. It's not something that I'm acutely aware of. So I'll say for those who aren't privy, I'll say to the listeners who aren't privy, more myself, Ted, can you just summarize what regulatory surveillance actually means?
Okay, so as you mentioned in your introduction, it has, the term surveillance has crept out across the industry's agenda. And again, as you mentioned, it is all-encompassing. It is a very broad definition. But at hand, it means what kind of systems and controls are going to be in place to monitor the industry's engagement at the ground level with consumers. And it's broad in its definition because it can encompass a number of things. It can be stake limits, it can be the regulations in themselves, but it can also be, it's also the monitoring of the player as he plays on the platform. And again, this points towards a huge compliance cost being undertaken by the operators, and also kind of the rewriting of the rules of the terms of play between the operator and the regulatory authority itself. And this has all come to play pretty much in the last 12 months.
Perfect. And I'm going to direct the next question to both of you because I feel like you might have different opinions on this, but why do you believe, and Martyn, we'll come to you first, why do you believe surveillance has crept up in 2023?
Well, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly, but in a number of countries, safer gambling or problem gambling, however you want to term it, has become a real political football. There's a lot of people talking about it. And governments are under a little bit of pressure to do something about it. So I think this kind of higher level debate suits governments more than getting into actual nuts and bolts of how the industry works on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's driven by external forces because while some within the industry might welcome it, the costs involved are likely to be substantial. So there's a lot on the negative column for the industry itself.
Okay, so I'd like to add to what Martyn said, which is absolutely correct. But I think there's also kind of the evolution of these themes that have been in gaming. So take, for example, duty of care. Duty of care is now kind of evolving or transitioning towards how do you view the player, right? Also conduct, the duty of the license. And one of the things that that has been reported on by the industry is that these things are evolving. And from a regulatory level, they want to see kind of direct actions, direct plannings, and they want to see an industry that can confront its problems straight away, right? Or its regulatory concerns straight away, that it can act on the front foot. And they believe that surveillance is the best way forward.
And just on regulatory surveillance, Ted, I'm going to come back to you on this one. Martyn, you can chime in after if you have anything to add. What is the debate and discussion currently at hand in regards to it?
Okay, so it's again, I'm repeating myself first. Saying, look, it is a broad debate here, and it has crept in. But the debate here is that, look, if you go down this route of how do you take surveillance, how do you account for every player playing on a platform? What game are they playing? You will have, at a point, you will have some consumer conflicts, consumer fight back. It's not great for the consumer that you have someone overseeing what are you doing. Also, the cost of compliance will likely go up. But there's also a technical element of how much of this can you impose? How effective can you be? And, what are the timelines for kind of adding these controls in? So this is happening across the board. If you look at a country like Spain, from the end of this year, they're going to start adding very, very tough compliance reporting, also database registries. They're going to be much tougher on kind of the intervention of when a player hits certain deposit limits. So again, this is all part of the discussion that is evolving.
Do you think we might see a little bit more from some more interventions from people like David Davis? Spends most of his life speaking out on sort of surveillance and freedom type issues. Because there's a lot, it seems a little bit Big Brother. Well intentioned, the outcome of it, but if you're monitoring everybody's gambling habit, and sorry, habit, probably the wrong word in this context, obviously, gambling behaviour, how much they're depositing, how much they're staking on various games and various bets and so on. Is that tipping over into too much surveillance for, in a democratic society? And the argument, and I don't particularly agree with this, but one which always comes from that element of that wing of politics is that when you're doing one thing, it'll tip over into other parts of society, this level of surveillance. So I think we might see some political kickback against this coming up in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. And you've kind of mentioned one of the difficulties there regarding political kickbacks. And one thing I want to ask you next is, what do you think are more real-life difficulties of imposing these surveillance controls?
Again, this comes back to how the consumer approach of imposing, surveillance on your players. Some of them might not like it, and then you are literally going to give them to the black market. Say, look, here's your ticket to go and play on an unlicensed website. The other thing is the controls in themselves, imposing them. They're going to be much tougher on deposit limits and staking. So again, I think there's a fear that you create kind of this overbearing kind of Big Brother or kind of nanny state element to gambling, that I have to go through checks and boundaries every time I want to put on a bet, every time I want to play a hand of blackjack. And it's like how there's, look, everyone is, I think all the leadership are on board for higher standards, right? But if you cause friction between that and a player just wanting to play casual gaming, right? This could fall back very easily.
Yeah, there's loads of practical difficulties when you get into the details of this. You mentioned Spain before, Ted, and they're trying to bring in this cross-operator deposit limit, which is a laudable end in terms of player safety. But they're not going to tell any of the operators what each player's limit is. So if a player is able to go above their total limit, who's at fault? So there's all these seemingly small sort of technical details to iron out, which when you add them all together, it's likely to be really complex technical solution that is needed to do any of these things. So the bigger question is perhaps, are we heading towards, are we aiming as an industry and as governments for an over-engineered solution to what is in some ways a relatively small problem? It's a big problem for individuals who have a gambling disorder, but prevalence of gambling disorder, which is what these things are largely designed to tackle, and prevalence of those problems is relatively small. So, it brings into question: is this money better spent on, for example, education, treatment, and so on? But I think we might have gone past that point in the discussion here.
It will be. Look, I mean, if we are really talking about facing an era of surveillance, I mean, this is a debate that you got to kind of focus on. That you are talking about how will that relationship with the customer change, and you will have a direct oversight of the government when someone plays gambling. I don't see kind of any consumer benefits in that.
During this podcast, you've both mentioned a different market in Spain. As we all know, certainly in Western Europe, we've had different regulatory standards within different markets. How do each market, certainly in the Western Europe, kind of harmonise and kind of work together on this term of surveillance and regulatory surveillance?
Harmonization and surveillance, right? Actually, they've just had the European regulators meeting, I think CREF, and it was a theme that got brought up, with surveillance and how much surveillance you should have over an industry, and what is the regulator's duty of care towards the customer. And this in itself is, I mean, my concern here is that, are they trying to kind of budge surveillance into a harmonization package and say, look, this is going to be the standard of how every government should be treating gambling, right, as a regulatory discipline? And I think that's very scary. One of the things about surveillance, right, and regulatory surveillance is that, okay, look, it is a bleak term, right, but not every one of its facets is negative, right? And I think this is, if you're in the industry now, you got to kind of break down this subject matter and say, look, what are the good parts here, right? What is our response to this factor that to this element that they want to add into gambling, right? Because if you don't control the debate now, it could kind of spiral out onto creating these huge kind of registries or these kind of huge silos of data and say, look, this is what a player does, and this is his interaction, and this is how we market to him, and control, and kind of regulators wanting to have control over kind of every component of iGaming. And I think here it's now, if we're heading in that direction, right, it's time to kind of look at it and say, look, what are the positive, what is the stuff that we can actually work on here?
What do you think you could work on in that scenario?
Again, I mean, if you look at Sweden, one of the big ones that came in, and it was Kindred, TVG, and Swenson Spell. It's again kind of data sharing and saying, look, we got problem gamblers, we got high risk players, we can share this information, right? And we can, siphon these guys away, get them help, assist them. And that's actually progressive and working on the front foot, right? I mean, that's a good good starting point. Again, we mentioned this in so many podcasts. It's where we want to get better data in the industry and more effective data that can be used kind of academically. So again, let's start cooperating there. Find out what the researchers need. Get some real defining metrics on prevalence and at-risk gamblers across markets. It's really not that hard.
There are positives. There are potential positives out there. We've identified the biggest one, which is operators potentially working together, whether that's on a voluntary basis or a state audit basis, to protect individual customers, sharing that information where people do have a problem. Although, there are, I think, some commercial risks, commercial considerations that can be got on with that. Whether or not things like the data protection and consumer rights issues can be sidestepped around that, I'm not sure. I think that's a good thing. You might also be looking a bit further down the line at of a certain, if operators are sharing information about behaviour around certain games, certain offers, that kind of thing, other things which particularly attract problem gamblers to spend the money and spend it quickly. Can we, eradicate those games or change those games at the very least? So there are some plus points to this kind of approach. It's my fear is what we end up with might be an overreach that goes beyond that, and has a negative effect on the consumer experience.
Just to wrap up the podcast, let's look towards the future a little bit. Where do you see this debate heading?
If we're at the start of this debate, and if this is kind of what is going to dawn out of the compliance era of gambling that will lead to a state of surveillance, I think the industry has to kind of accept its mandate, right? But also work together towards kind of creating kind of an influence and a better debate about, look, if it is about surveillance, what level, how should this be taken on board? Also, how should the consumer be treated? Again, there'll be a lot of kind of discussion about consumer redress in this. But finally, what I'd say is that in terms of the actual policies and the debates themselves, I think as an industry, you got to target or reach for a higher standard of debate on this. Because as I say, it's a very broad discussion, right? But you got to kind of find the elements that are good in that. So look, we are willing to work together to make gambling safer.
And Martyn, what about you? Do you see anything, certainly in regards we've mentioned about data sharing, do you see anything on the level of TikTok v the US Congress or the scandals of data Analytica when it comes to this stuff? Oh, sorry, Cambridge Analytica.
I don't think it'll reach the public in the same way because it's a far smaller percentage of the population involved in regular gambling inside the lottery than there are on social media and so on. So I don't think it'll hit that. One thing I'm quite interested to see how this plays out is that if we do go down this route of more surveillance and it's the industry itself or the operators themselves that end up paying for this, can these small operators survive with these added costs? If you run a chain of, 20 betting shops in the north of England, your ability to do this, to get involved in this record sharing and record keeping and so on, is far less than if you're a FTSE 100 company. So I think we might see a bit of a squeeze commercially as a result of this. But I don't know whether that will play into the discussion down the line or not, really.
I'd just like to add to that, to what Martyn said. I mean, look, if we're now in the age of compliance, aren't these smaller operators? I mean, they're the guys who should have died out before we enter this stage of surveillance. I think this is reserved for the big gambling PLCs. We'll just have to wait and see.
Perfect. And on waiting and seeing, the listeners, again, they can keep going to sbcnews.co.uk, where Ted will be over this. If there's anything new, when he waits and sees, he'll report any breaking news when it comes. If there's any articles relating to the topic at hand today, I will leave them in the description below. And on that, Ted and Martyn, thank you for joining me today on the latest episode of iGaming Daily, sponsored by SBC Summit Barcelona. And to the listeners out there, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with SBC Summit Barcelona, being held at the Fira Barcelona Montjuic on the 19th to the 21st of September. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.